I was standing in the cramped kitchen of my grandfather's downtown apartment, boxing up his belongings while my family divided up his real assets 3 floors below in the lawyer's office. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was cleaning out the home of the only person who ever truly saw me, while everyone else was downstairs calculating their inheritance. My hands trembled as I wrapped his coffee mug in newspaper, the same blue ceramic mug he'd used every morning for 20 years. Nobody had asked me to be here. Nobody had assigned me this task. I'd simply shown up because someone needed to, and I'd learned long ago that someone was usually me. From the window, I could see the Martinez Hardware Store across the street, the family business my great-grandfather had built in 1952. The same business I'd grown up in, sweeping floors and organizing inventory, dreaming of the day I might help run it. That dream had died the same day my sister Jessica got her real estate license and started calling our small family operation Quaint. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Claire Martinez, and for 32 years, I've been the daughter who didn't quite fit the mold my parents had cast for success. While my sister Jessica built a real estate empire in Columbus, complete with billboards featuring her perfectly highlighted smile, I chose a different path. I became a social worker in Portland, Oregon, helping teenagers who'd aged out of the foster system find their footing in an unforgiving world. The decision to move 2,000 miles away hadn't been dramatic or rebellious. It had been quiet, like everything else I'd ever done that mattered. I'd simply realized one day that I was tired of being a supporting character in my own family's story, so I wrote myself into a different one entirely. Growing up in Riverside, Ohio, our family dynamic had been established early and never questioned. Jessica was the golden child, the one who inherited our mother Linda's sharp business sense and our father Bob's natural charisma. She'd been student council president, prom queen, and had somehow convinced everyone that selling houses made her a visionary entrepreneur. Her children, Emma and Noah, were extensions of her success, perfect little reflections of their mothers. Ambition dressed in designer clothes for family photos. Then there was me, the one who asked too many questions about why we charged Mrs. Henderson full price when everyone knew her husband's disability check barely covered their rent. The one who suggested we sponsor the high school's art program instead of the golf tournament. The one who brought home stray cats and kids who needed someone to listen. My parents had tolerated my phase through high school, certain I'd eventually outgrow my bleeding heart and join Jessica in the family business. When I announced my acceptance to Portland State's social work program, the silence at dinner had stretched so long I'd wondered if they'd all forgotten how to speak. Social work, my mother had finally said, the same tone she might use to say sewage treatment. My father had been more direct. Claire, honey, that's not a career. That's volunteer work with a fancy degree. Only Grandpa Frank had smiled. Takes courage to choose people over profit, he'd said quietly, and I'd loved him fiercely for those 7 words. Frank Martinez had been different from the rest of our family in ways that went deeper than his preference for walking over driving, or his habit of reading actual newspapers instead of scrolling through his phone. He'd built the hardware store from nothing, but unlike my parents, he'd never seemed impressed by his own success. He treated every customer the same, whether they were buying a single screw or planning a major renovation. On weekends, when Jessica was busy with soccer practice and piano lessons and a dozen other activities designed to build her resume, I'd ride my bike downtown to spend time with Grandpa Frank. He'd let me help customers, teach me about different types of wood and which tools worked best for specific jobs. More importantly, he'd listen when I talked about books I was reading or ideas I had about making the world fairer. You see things differently, Claire, he'd tell me. That's not a weakness. That's your strength. When I left for college, he'd been the only one who seemed genuinely proud. He'd driven me to the airport himself, pressed an envelope with $500 into my hands and said, "Don't let them make you smaller than you are." Those words had carried me through 4 years of school, through my move to Portland, through building a life that felt authentic, even when it felt lonely. We'd stayed in touch through letters, actual handwritten letters that I'd treasured because they reminded me that someone back home still cared about who I was becoming. The last letter had arrived 2 weeks before his death. It had been shorter than usual, just a few lines about how proud he was of my work with the youth center and a cryptic comment about making sure the right things go to the right people. I'd planned to call him to ask what he meant, but then my mother had called. First with news that he'd suffered a massive heart attack while opening the store that Tuesday morning. The funeral had been exactly what I'd expected. A carefully orchestrated performance of grief with my parents managing logistics, and Jessica holding court with visitors who wanted to express their condolences to the successful granddaughter. I'd sat in the back, watching my family navigate their loss like they navigated everything else, with an eye toward appearances and efficiency. Michael Thompson, Jessica's husband, had spent most of the service calculating how much the store might be worth if they sold the property to developers. My mother had fretted about whether the flowers looked expensive enough. My father had networked with other business owners who'd come to pay their respects. Only Emma and Noah, my 8- and 10-year-old niece and nephew, had seemed genuinely sad. They'd loved their great-grandfather's stories and his patience with their endless questions about how things worked. Watching them try to understand why Grandpa Frank wouldn't be there to teach them anymore had been the hardest part of the entire week. I'd flown back to Portland immediately after the funeral, assuming that would be the end of my involvement in family affairs. I'd assumed correctly until David Kellerman's call came 3 weeks later. "Ms. Martinez," the lawyer had said, his voice carrying the formal weight of legal business, "I need you to return to Riverside for the reading of your grandfather's will." "I'm sure whatever he left me will be fine to handle over the phone," I'd replied, already mentally preparing for some small token, maybe his tool collection or a few pieces of furniture nobody else wanted. "I'm afraid that won't be possible," Kellerman had said. "Your presence is specifically required. The will contains some unusual provisions that need to be addressed in person." The flight back to Ohio had given me too much time to think about what unusual provisions might mean. Grandpa Frank had never been wealthy in the way my family measured wealth. He'd lived simply, saved carefully, but the store barely broke even most years. Whatever he'd left behind would probably amount to a few $1,000s and some sentimental items. I'd booked a hotel room rather than staying with my parents, a decision that had earned me a lecture from my mother about putting on airs and wasting money we don't have. The conversation had reminded me exactly why I'd moved across the country in the first place. The morning of the will reading, I'd arrived at Kellerman's office to find my entire family already assembled in the conference room. Jessica wore a black suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent, her expression a careful balance of appropriate grief and barely contained excitement. Michael sat beside her, checking his phone every few minutes like he had somewhere more important to be. My parents flanked Emma and Noah, who seemed confused about why they needed to be there but pleased to miss school. Everyone had exchanged the kind of small talk that people make when they're waiting for something significant to happen, discussing the weather and traffic and anything except why we were really there. Now that everyone's present, Kellerman had begun, adjusting his glasses and opening a thick folder. "We can proceed with the reading of Franklin Martinez's last will and testament." The early items had been exactly what I'd expected. Small amounts to various charities, his tools to my father, some jewelry to my mother, a modest education fund for Emma and Noah that would help with college expenses someday. Everyone had nodded approvingly at these sensible, predictable bequests. "The hardware store," Kellerman had continued, "including all inventory, equipment, and the building itself, is left to Robert and Linda Martinez, with the understanding that it will eventually pass to their children and grandchildren as they see fit." My parents had exchanged satisfied glances. Jessica had smiled the particular smile she reserved for moments when things went according to plan. This was the inheritance everyone had been expecting, the logical conclusion to a lifetime of family business. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. However, Kellerman had said, and that single word had changed the entire atmosphere in the room. There are additional assets not previously disclosed to the family. The silence that followed had been sharp and curious. Additional assets? Grandpa Frank had lived in the same small apartment for 30 years, drove a truck that was older than I was, and bought his clothes at the discount store. What additional assets could there possibly be? Over the past 40 years, Kellerman had continued, reading directly from the will. Frank Martinez made careful investments in real estate, stocks, and municipal bonds. These investments, along with savings accounts held at various banks, constitute the majority of his estate. Michael had leaned forward, suddenly very interested. Jessica's smile had intensified. My parents had looked confused but hopeful. The total value of these additional assets, Kellerman had said, pausing for what felt like an eternity, is approximately $2 million. The number had hung in the air like a physical presence. $2 million. From a man who'd clipped coupons and reused aluminum foil and never owned a car that wasn't at least 15 years old. There must be some mistake, my mother had whispered. I assure you there's no mistake, Kellerman had replied. Mr. Martinez was very methodical in his record-keeping. He also left explicit instructions about how these assets should be distributed. Jessica had pulled out her phone, probably calculating her share. Michael had started taking notes on a legal pad he'd produced from nowhere. My parents had stared at each other like they'd just discovered their humble hardware store owner father had been living a secret life. According to the will, Kellerman had continued, these assets are to be divided equally among Frank Martinez's grandchildren. Emma and Noah had looked around the room, trying to understand why the adults had suddenly gotten so quiet. At 8 and 10, they had no concept of what $2 million meant, but they could sense the shift in energy. So Emma, Noah, and Claire will each receive approximately $1 million, Kellerman had clarified, though his tone suggested there was more coming. That seems fair, Jessica had said quickly, probably already planning how she'd manage her children's inheritance until they came of age. We'll need to set up trusts, of course, and make sure the money is invested properly until they're old enough to— I'm not finished, Kellerman had interrupted gently. There's an additional provision specifically regarding Claire Martinez. Every eye in the room had turned to me. I'd felt the familiar sensation of being examined, evaluated, found wanting or surprising depending on the observer. But this time, something had been different. This time, I'd been specifically mentioned. Frank Martinez left the following instructions, Kellerman had read, his voice taking on the formal cadence reserved for legal documents. To my granddaughter Claire, who chose compassion over comfort and people over profit, I leave an additional bequest that reflects my admiration for the woman she has become. The words had washed over me like warm water. Grandpa Frank's voice, speaking from beyond death, acknowledging choices I'd made that my family had never understood. In addition to her share of the divided assets, Kellerman had continued, Claire Martinez is to receive the entirety of Frank Martinez's real estate holdings, which include 17 rental properties throughout Central Ohio, as well as a commercial building in downtown Columbus, currently leased to a law firm. The silence this time had been absolute. 17 rental properties, a commercial building in Columbus. I'd felt like I was hearing about someone else's life, someone else's inheritance. The total value of these properties, Kellerman had said, is estimated at $8 million. Michael's pen had stopped moving. Jessica's smile had disappeared entirely. My parents had stared at me like I'd suddenly grown a second head. That's impossible, my father had said. Dad never owned any rental properties. He lived in that tiny apartment his whole life. Mr. Martinez was a very private man regarding his investments, Kellerman had replied. He preferred that his family see him as a simple shopkeeper rather than a real estate investor. The properties were all purchased through a holding company he established in 1987. I'd tried to process what I was hearing, but the numbers had felt too large, too unreal. Grandpa Frank, who darned his own socks and saved twist ties from bread bags, had been quietly building a real estate empire for decades. "There's one final provision," Kellerman had said, reaching for a sealed envelope. Frank Martinez recorded a video message to be played after the reading of the will. He specifically requested that all family members be present for this. The screen had flickered to life, and there he was. Grandpa Frank, sitting in his favorite chair in the apartment I'd been cleaning out that morning, looking directly into the camera with eyes that seemed to see straight through time. "If you're watching this," he'd begun, his voice exactly as I remembered it, steady and kind, "then you know I've been keeping some secrets." He'd smiled, the same gentle smile I'd seen 1,000 times when he'd helped confused customers at the store or listened to my teenage problems. "I want you all to understand something important," he'd continued. "Money is a tool, not a goal. I spent 40 years watching too many people forget that distinction. I saved and invested not because I loved money, but because I wanted to make sure the people I loved would have choices." Emma had reached for Noah's hand, sensing the importance of the moment, even if she didn't understand the details. "Linda and Bob," Grandpa Frank had said, his gaze seeming to find my parents even through the recording, "you've built a good life, and you've raised 2 daughters who are capable of remarkable things. The store will give you security, but more importantly, it will give you purpose for as long as you want it." My parents had sat perfectly still, absorbing words from a man they'd thought they'd known completely. "Jessica and Michael," he'd continued, "you've already proven you can create success. Emma and Noah will have opportunities because of your hard work and their inheritance. Use wisdom to guide them toward happiness, not just achievement." Jessica had nodded, though I'd noticed her jaw was still tight with surprise. "And Claire?" Grandpa Frank had said, and his voice had gotten softer, warmer. "My dear granddaughter who always saw what others missed and cared about what others ignored. You left home to follow your heart, and it led you to work that matters. The properties I'm leaving you aren't a reward for being different. They're tools to help you do more of what you're already doing." Tears had started down my cheeks without my permission. Even in death, Grandpa Frank had understood me better than anyone else ever had. "The rental income from those properties," he'd explained, "will give you the freedom to help people without worrying about your own survival. You can expand your programs, start new ones, or simply have the peace of mind that comes from financial security while doing work that doesn't pay what it should." The video had continued for a few more minutes, with Grandpa Frank sharing memories and expressing love for each family member. But his words to me had echoed in my mind, drowning out everything else. He'd seen my work, understood its value, and given me the means to do more of it. When the screen had gone dark, the room had remained quiet for a long moment. Then Michael had cleared his throat and asked the question that had probably been burning in everyone's mind. "Is this legally binding? I mean, can the will be contested?" Kellerman had looked at him with the patience of a man who'd been practicing law for 30 years. Mr. Martinez worked with multiple attorneys over several years to ensure this will was uncontestable. Every provision has been carefully structured to meet all legal requirements. "But surely there must be some way to," Jessica had begun. "No," Kellerman had said firmly. "The will is ironclad." Frank Martinez was very specific about his intentions, and he took extensive precautions to ensure they would be carried out exactly as written. I'd sat there, still trying to process the enormity of what had just happened. In the span of an hour, I'd gone from being the forgotten daughter cleaning out an apartment to being a millionaire several times over. But more than the money, more than the properties, what had overwhelmed me was the recognition. Grandpa Frank had seen who I was and what I was trying to do, and he'd made sure I could continue doing it. The meeting had ended with arrangements for property transfers and tax implications, and a dozen other legal details that would need to be handled over the coming weeks. Everyone had shaken hands with Kellerman and made polite conversation about next steps, but the underlying tension had been unmistakable. As we'd filed out of the office, Jessica had caught my arm. "Claire, we need to talk. Just us." I'd known that conversation was coming, just as I'd known it would be awkward and probably painful. But for the first time in my life, I'd felt like I was walking into a family discussion from a position of strength rather than apology. Standing on the sidewalk outside Kellerman's office, watching my family process what had just happened, I'd realized that Grandpa Frank's final gift wasn't just financial security. It was validation. For 32 years, I'd wondered if choosing people over profit made me naive or idealistic, or simply wrong about what mattered in life. Now I knew. The man I'd respected most in the world had spent decades quietly building something remarkable, and he'd chosen to trust me with continuing his work in my own way. The inheritance would change my life, certainly. But Grandpa Frank's faith in who I was and what I was doing would change something deeper. For the first time since leaving home, I felt like I truly belonged somewhere, even if that somewhere was a calling rather than a place. The call came at 7 a.m, 2 days after the will reading. I was sitting in my hotel room staring at a stack of legal documents that David Kellerman had given me, trying to make sense of property deeds and tax assessments and rental agreements. The phone's sharp ring cut through the silence like a blade. "Claire." My mother's voice carried that particular tone I remembered from childhood, the one that meant a family conference was about to be called whether I wanted one or not. "We need to discuss what happened yesterday, as a family." I'd been expecting this conversation, dreading it really, but knowing it was inevitable. The Martinez family had never been good at processing surprises, especially ones that disrupted the established order of things. Grandpa Frank's will had definitely disrupted the established order. "When?" I asked, because there was no point in pretending I had a choice about whether to participate. "This afternoon, 2 o'clock, at the house." My mother paused, and I could hear her choosing her words carefully. "Jessica thinks it would be good if we all sat down together and figured out how to handle this situation responsibly." Responsibly. There was that word again, the same one my family had been using to describe their concerns about my life choices for the past 15 years. Claire needs to be more responsible about her career. Claire needs to think responsibly about her future. Claire needs to make responsible decisions about money. "I'll be there," I said, because refusing would only delay the inevitable and probably make things worse. "Good. And Claire?" My mother's voice softened slightly. "Nobody's angry. We just want to make sure you're protected." Protected. As if inheriting millions of dollars from someone who loved me was a dangerous situation I needed to be rescued from. I spent the morning walking through downtown Riverside, trying to clear my head before facing whatever intervention my family had planned. The town looked exactly the same as it had when I was growing up. The same mix of small businesses struggling to compete with the big box stores on the highway. The same carefully maintained downtown that relied on nostalgia and stubbornness to survive. I found myself standing across from the hardware store, watching my father help an elderly man load lumber into the back of a pickup truck. Dad moved with the easy confidence of someone who'd been doing the same job for 30 years. Someone who knew exactly where he belonged in the world. For a moment, I envied him that certainty. The Martinez family home sat on Maple Street in the kind of neighborhood where people knew each other's business and kept their lawns meticulously trimmed. I'd grown up in that house, learned to ride a bike in the driveway, scraped my knees on the front steps, and dreamed of all the places I'd go when I was old enough to leave. Now, walking up the familiar path, I felt like a stranger returning to a place that had never quite been home. Jessica's car was already there, a sleek black SUV that probably cost more than most people made in a year. Through the living room window, I could see everyone gathered around the coffee table, Emma and Noah playing quietly in the corner while the adults prepared for whatever difficult conversation they'd planned. My mother opened the door before I could knock, as if she'd been watching for me. "Claire, honey, come in. We're all here." The living room looked exactly as I remembered it. The same floral sofa and matching chairs, the same family photos arranged. On the mantel, showing Jessica's achievements and milestones. There had never been photos of my college graduation or my work with the youth center, but there were plenty of pictures of Jessica receiving various real estate awards and Emma and Noah at their school events. "Claire," Jessica said, standing, up to hug me with the kind of embrace that looked affectionate but felt calculated. "I'm so glad you could make it. We've been talking, and we think there might be some things you haven't considered about this inheritance situation." Michael nodded from his position on the sofa, a legal pad already covered with notes sitting on his lap. My parents looked uncomfortable but determined, like people preparing to have a necessary but unpleasant conversation. "What kinds of things?" I asked, settling into the chair that had always been designated as mine during family meetings. "Well," Jessica began, her voice taking on the patient tone she used with difficult clients, "managing real estate is incredibly complex. There are tax implications, maintenance costs, tenant issues, market fluctuations. It's really a full-time job that requires specific expertise." "And experience," Michael added. "I mean, you've been focused on social work, which is admirable, but property management is a completely different skill set." I nodded, waiting to hear where this was going, though I suspected I already knew. "We've been researching property management companies," my father said, pulling out a folder thick with printed articles and business cards. "There are several excellent firms in Columbus that specialize in handling rental portfolios exactly like the one Dad left you." "They could take care of everything," my mother chimed in. "Collect rent, handle repairs, deal with problem tenants. You wouldn't have to worry about any of the day-to-day headaches." Jessica leaned forward, her expression earnest and concerned. "Claire, we're not trying to tell you what to do with your inheritance, but we love you, and we want to make sure you don't get overwhelmed or taken advantage of." "Taken advantage of how?" I asked. "Well, you're not exactly experienced in business," Michael said, consulting his notes. "There are all kinds of people who prey on inexperienced property owners. Contractors who overcharge for work, tenants who know how to exploit sympathetic, landlords, real estate agents who convince people to sell at below-market prices. Plus, the tax situation is going to be incredibly complicated," Jessica added. "You'll need accountants, lawyers, insurance agents. The annual paperwork alone will be a nightmare." Emma looked up from her coloring book, sensing the tension in the room even if she didn't understand the details. "Mommy, why does everyone sound worried?" "We're not worried, sweetheart," Jessica said, her voice instantly switching to the gentle tone she used with her children. "We're just talking about grown-up things." Noah abandoned his toy cars and climbed onto my father's lap, apparently deciding that whatever the adults were discussing was less interesting than the promise of grandpa cuddles. My father automatically adjusted his position to accommodate his grandson, and I was struck by how natural the interaction was, how easily my parents had slipped into their grandparent roles. "Here's what we're thinking," my mother said, pulling out a manila folder of her own. "What if you hired a property management company to handle the rentals, and we helped you set up a trust or investment account with the income? That way you'd have financial security without having to deal with all the stress and complexity. You could keep doing your social work," my father added. "Follow your passion without worrying about money. Isn't that what you've always wanted?" They weren't wrong exactly. Financial security would allow me to focus on my work without the constant underlying anxiety about rent and student loans and whether I could afford to fix my car when it inevitably broke down. But something about their eager helpfulness felt off, like they were solving a problem I hadn't asked them to solve. "What about the properties themselves?" I asked. "I mean, beyond just hiring someone to manage them. What do you think I should do with them long term?" Jessica and Michael exchanged a quick glance, the kind of wordless communication that happens between couples who've discussed something extensively in private. "Well," Jessica said carefully, "some of them are in pretty rough neighborhoods. Properties that might be better suited for redevelopment than long-term rental income." "Redevelopment?" I repeated. "There's a lot of potential for commercial development in some of those areas," Michael explained, his voice taking on the enthusiasm he usually reserved for his own business ventures. "With the right investment and planning, you could probably triple the value of some of those properties. Of course, that would require selling to developers," Jessica added quickly, "which means dealing with commercial real estate agents, construction companies, zoning boards. It's extremely complicated, but potentially very profitable," Michael said. "I've been looking at comparable sales in those neighborhoods, and some of those lots are worth significantly more as development opportunities than as rental properties." I felt something cold settle in my stomach as I began to understand what they were really suggesting. They weren't just offering to help me manage Grandpa Frank's properties. They were proposing that I sell them. "Has anyone actually looked at these properties?" I asked. "I mean, physically visited them?" My parents looked confused by the question. Jessica shook her head. "Claire, we don't need to see them to understand the financial implications. The important thing is making sure you're getting the best return on your investment." "But what if they're not just investments?" I asked. "What if they're homes where people live?" "Well, of course they're homes," my mother said, as if I'd stated something obvious. "But honey, you can't let sentiment cloud your business judgment. Your grandfather was an investor, not a charity." That was where they were wrong, and I realized they didn't understand Grandpa Frank any better than they understood me. He had been running a charity, in his own quiet way. He'd just been smart enough to make it financially sustainable. "I think I'd like to see the properties before I make any decisions about management companies or development opportunities," I said. "That's probably not necessary," Michael said quickly. "I can put together a comprehensive analysis based on public records and market data. You don't need to waste time driving around to look at buildings." "It's not a waste of time if they belong to me," I replied, and something in my tone must have suggested that the conversation was moving in a direction they hadn't planned for. Jessica tried a different approach. "Claire, I know this is all overwhelming. When I got my first big commission, I was completely paralyzed by all the decisions I had to make. But you don't have to figure everything out right now. Why don't you take some time to think about it? Maybe talk to some financial advisors, get some professional opinions." "That's a good idea," I said. "I think I will get some professional opinions." "Excellent," my mother said, visibly relieved. "We can recommend some people. Bob knows several accountants who specialize in rental property, and Jessica has connections with investment advisors who work with high net worth clients." "I'm sure they're very good," I said diplomatically. "But I think I'd prefer to find my own advisors." Another glance passed between Jessica and Michael, this one less subtle. They were starting to realize that their helpful intervention wasn't going according to plan. "Of course," Jessica said, though her smile looked a little strained. "That's completely your choice. I just think it would be easier if you worked with people we already trust." "Easier for who?" I asked. The question hung in the air for a moment, creating the kind of awkward silence that meant someone had said something they couldn't take back. "Easier for you, obviously," Michael said, but his voice lacked conviction. Emma had stopped coloring and was looking back and forth between the adults, clearly picking up on the tension. Noah had fallen asleep in my father's arms, blissfully unaware that his inheritance was being discussed along with mine. "Claire," my mother said, her voice taking on the slightly desperate edge it got when family conversations started going off script. "We're just trying to help. We don't want you to make mistakes that could cost you financially or personally." "What kinds of mistakes?" I asked. "Well, for instance," Jessica said, "if you try to manage these properties yourself, you're going to have to deal with tenant complaints, maintenance emergencies, eviction proceedings. It's going to consume your entire life. You won't have time for your real work." "And what if something goes wrong?" my father added. "What if there's a fire or a lawsuit or a major repair that costs tens of thousands of dollars? You don't have experience handling those kinds of crises. Plus, you're all the way in Portland," my mother pointed out. "How are you going to manage properties in Ohio from Oregon? You'd have to move back here, give up the life you've built." They were painting a picture of inherited wealth as a burden, a complication that would ruin my life rather than improve it. But I kept thinking about Grandpa Frank's words in the video, about the rental income giving me freedom to do more of what I was already doing. "Maybe I wouldn't mind moving back to Ohio," I said, testing their reaction. The silence that followed was telling. My parents looked uncomfortable. Jessica looked alarmed. "Claire, you've built a life in Portland," my mother said carefully. "You have friends there, work that matters to you. Why would you want to give that up?" "Besides," Jessica added, "the rental market here isn't what it used to be. A lot of those neighborhoods are declining. Property values are stagnant. You'd probably be better off liquidating the portfolio and investing in something with better growth potential." Liquidating. That was the word they'd been dancing around all afternoon. They wanted me to sell Grandpa Frank's properties, convert them to cash, and let them help me invest the money in something safer and more conventional. "What do you think Grandpa Frank would want me to do?" I asked. "Oh, honey," my mother said, her voice gentle but patronizing. "Your grandfather lived in a different time. The real estate market has changed dramatically since he started buying those properties. I'm sure if he were alive today, he'd want you to make the smartest financial decision. He always said you were the practical one in the family," my father added. "He'd want you to use your head, not your heart." That was when I knew they'd completely misunderstood both me and Grandpa Frank. He'd left me those properties precisely because he knew I would use my heart along with my head. He'd trusted me to see them as more than just financial assets. "I think," I said slowly, "that I need to see the properties before I make any decisions about what to do with them." "Claire," Jessica said, her patience finally showing signs of wear, "you're not listening to what we're trying to tell you. Managing rental properties is not like running a youth program. It's business. It requires skills you don't have and experience you haven't gained." "Then maybe it's time I gained some experience," I replied. Michael set down his legal pad with more force than necessary. "Look, Claire, I don't think you understand the liability issues alone. If someone gets hurt on one of those properties, if there's a discrimination lawsuit, if the city decides to condemn a building for code violations, you could lose everything. Not just the rental income, but your personal assets, too." "That's what insurance is for," I said. "Insurance doesn't cover everything," Jessica snapped, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking. "And premiums for rental properties in some of those neighborhoods are astronomical. You could end up spending more on insurance and legal fees than you make in rent." "How do you know what neighborhoods they're in?" I asked. Jessica realized her mistake immediately. Michael looked up the addresses, just to get a general sense of the portfolio. "And what did you find?" Michael consulted his notes, clearly wishing he didn't have to answer. "Several of the properties are in areas that have experienced significant economic decline. High crime rates, low property values, difficulty maintaining occupancy." "In other words," I said, "the kinds of neighborhoods where people who work minimum wage jobs can afford to live." "That's not the point," Jessica said. "The point is that they're not good investments." "Maybe they're not supposed to be investments," I said. "Maybe they're supposed to be homes." My mother sighed. the kind of long-suffering exhalation that meant she thought I was being deliberately difficult. "Claire, you can't save the world by being a landlord. If you want to help people, there are much more efficient ways to do it." "Like what?" "Donations to established charities," my father suggested. "Organizations that already have the infrastructure and expertise to help people effectively." "You could endow a scholarship program," Jessica added, "or fund a community center. Something that would have a real impact without putting you personally at risk." They were offering me ways to be generous with money while staying safely removed from the actual lives of the people I'd be helping. It was the same approach my family had always taken to charity, writing checks to worthy causes while maintaining a comfortable distance from any actual need or struggle. "What if I don't want to stay safely removed?" I asked. "Then you're not thinking clearly," Michael said bluntly. "And maybe that's understandable. This inheritance is probably the biggest thing that's ever happened to you financially. It's natural to feel overwhelmed and make emotional decisions." Emma looked up again, her young face creased with worry. "Daddy, why are you all arguing?" "We're not arguing, sweetheart," Jessica said quickly. "We're just having a discussion about some important decisions Aunt Claire needs to make." But Emma was smart enough to recognize the difference between a discussion and an argument, and honest enough to call it what it was. "It sounds like arguing," she said quietly. She was right, and her simple observations seemed to deflate some of the tension in the room. We were arguing, and we were doing it in front of children who'd just lost their great-grandfather and were probably confused enough without having to witness family conflict. "Maybe we should table this conversation," my mother suggested. "Give everyone time to think things through more carefully." "That's probably a good idea," I agreed, standing up to leave. "Claire," Jessica said as I gathered my purse, "I hope you know we're only trying to help. We love you, and we want what's best for you." "I know," I said, and I did know. The problem was that their idea of what was best for me had always been based on what they would want for themselves, not on who I actually was or what actually mattered to me. Walking back to my car, I thought about Emma's observation. We had been arguing, but not really about property management or investment strategies or liability insurance. We'd been arguing about the same thing we'd always argued about, whether I was competent enough to make my own decisions and whether my values were practical enough to guide those decisions. The difference was that this time I had backup. Grandpa. Frank had given me more than money and property. He'd given me proof that someone who knew me well thought I was capable of handling something important. That validation changed everything, including my willingness to let my family's concerns override my own judgment. Driving back to the hotel, I made a decision that felt both terrifying and liberating. Tomorrow, I would start visiting Grandpa, Frank's properties, not to evaluate them as investments or development opportunities, but to understand what he'd built and why he'd trusted me to continue it. Whatever I found, whatever I decided to do, it would be my choice based on my values and my understanding of what mattered. For the first time in my adult life, I had the resources to act on my convictions without having to ask permission or justify my decisions to people who'd never understood them anyway. The thought was scary and exhilarating and completely unfamiliar. But as I parked outside the hotel and looked back toward the house where my family was probably still discussing my poor judgment and unrealistic expectations, I realized that unfamiliar didn't necessarily mean wrong. Maybe it was time to find out what I was actually capable of when I stopped trying to meet other people's expectations and started living up to my own. The first address on David Kellerman's list led me to a quiet street in the Hilltop neighborhood of Columbus, about 40 minutes from Riverside. I sat in my rental car for several minutes, studying the modest two-story house with its fresh coat of yellow paint and carefully maintained front garden. This was supposed to be one of the problem properties in a declining neighborhood that Michael had warned me about. The house looked nothing like the crumbling slum I'd been led to expect. The porch steps were solid, the windows were clean, and someone had recently planted marigolds along the walkway. A child's bicycle leaned against the front railing, and wind chimes hung from the porch ceiling, creating a gentle melody in the morning breeze. I checked the address 3 times before finally getting out of the car. According to the property records Kellerman had given me, this house had been owned by Frank Martinez since 1995. The current tenant was listed as Maria Santos, a single mother with 2 children who'd been living there for 8 years. Before I could lose my nerve, I walked up the front steps and knocked on the door. A woman in her 30s answered, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail and flour dusting her hands. She looked surprised to see a stranger on her doorstep, but not alarmed. "Can I help you?" she asked, wiping her hands on a kitchen towel. "I'm Claire Martinez," I said, feeling awkward and unsure of the proper protocol for introducing yourself to your own tenant. "I think you knew my grandfather, Frank Martinez." Maria's entire expression changed, her wariness replaced by genuine warmth. "Oh my goodness, you're Frank's granddaughter. Please, come in, come in." She stepped aside and gestured for me to enter. "I'm so sorry for your loss. Your grandfather was a wonderful man." The inside of the house was immaculate, decorated, with family photos and children's artwork. The smell of fresh bread filled the air, and I could hear cartoons playing softly from what was probably the living room. "I was just making bread for my neighbor," Maria explained, leading me toward the kitchen. "Mrs. Chen next door had surgery last week, and I thought she might like something homemade." She paused, studying my face. "You look like him, you know, around the eyes." "Thank you," I said, though I wasn't sure if that was the appropriate response to being compared to someone who'd just died. "Can I get you some coffee? Tea?" Maria asked, automatically moving toward the stove. "I have fresh cookies if you'd like some." "Coffee would be wonderful," I said, settling into one of the kitchen chairs she'd indicated. "Maria, I have to ask you something. What did you think of my grandfather as a landlord?" Maria stopped in the middle of reaching for mugs and turned to look at me with an expression of complete confusion. "As a landlord? Honey, your grandfather wasn't really like a landlord at all." "What do you mean?" Maria poured coffee into 2 ceramic mugs, added cream without asking if I wanted it, and sat down across from me at the small kitchen table. "Your grandfather was more like family. When my youngest, Diego, was born with breathing problems, Frank paid for the humidifier and air purifier the doctor recommended. When I lost my job 3 years ago, he told me not to worry about rent until I got back on my feet." She paused to sip her coffee, her eyes getting distant with memory. "He'd come by every month not to collect rent or inspect the property, but to check on us. He'd fix little things that needed fixing, bring Diego books about airplanes because he knew he loved them, ask about my job at the hospital." "He never raised your rent?" I asked. "Oh, he did," Maria said quickly, "but only when I insisted. He'd keep it the same for years, and I'd have to argue with him to accept market rate. He said housing should be affordable, that families needed stability more than landlords needed profit." I felt something tight in my chest, a mixture of pride and sadness and confirmation of something I'd suspected but hadn't dared hope for. "Did he ever talk about his family?" "All the time," Maria said, her face lighting up. "He was so proud of you. He'd show me articles you'd written for the youth center newsletter, tell me about programs you'd started. He said you understood that helping people wasn't just about money, it was about dignity." The kitchen fell quiet except for the sound of the bread timer ticking and muffled cartoon voices from the other room. I stared into my coffee, trying to process what Maria was telling me alongside what my family had said the day before. "Maria," I said carefully, "my family thinks I should sell these properties. They're concerned that managing rental properties will be too complicated and stressful for someone without experience." Maria set down her mug with a sharp clink. "Sell them? But what would happen to the families who live here?" "I don't know," I admitted. "I suppose they'd have to find somewhere else to live." Mrs. Rodriguez across the street has lived in Frank's house for 12 years, Maria said, her voice getting urgent. She's 74 years old and lives on Social Security. The Johnsons next door have 4 kids and both work at the grocery store. Where are they supposed to go if some developer buys these houses and tears them down? The reality of what my family was suggesting hit me with sudden clarity. They weren't just asking me to sell investment properties. They were asking me to displace families, to destroy the small community that Grandpa Frank had spent decades nurturing. I haven't made any decisions yet, I said quickly. I wanted to see the properties first, meet the people who live here. Relief flooded Maria's face. You're just like him, she said softly. He always said you'd understand. Understand what? That some things are more important than money, that taking care of people is what makes wealth worthwhile. Maria stood up and walked to a drawer near the refrigerator, pulling out a small stack of envelopes held together with a rubber band. He left these for you, said to give them to you when you came to visit. My hands shook as I took the envelopes. My name was written on the top one in Grandpa Frank's familiar handwriting, along with the words "Start here." Inside the first envelope was a brief note and a key. Claire, the note read, by the time you read this, you'll have met Maria and heard her story. She represents everything I hope to accomplish with these properties. The key is to the apartment, above the Martinez Hardware Store. That's where I kept my real records, the ones that matter. Love, Grandpa Frank. He said you'd need to see those records to understand what you'd inherited, Maria explained. He was very specific about that. 20 minutes later, I was climbing the narrow stairs to the apartment above my family's hardware store, using the key Grandpa Frank had left me. The apartment had been empty for as long as I could remember, just storage space for old inventory and seasonal decorations. But when I unlocked the door, I found something entirely different. The small space had been converted into an office, with filing cabinets lining one wall, a desk covered with notebooks and ledgers, and a corkboard covered with photographs and newspaper clippings. The photographs were what caught my attention first. Pictures of families standing in front of houses I recognized from the property list. Children playing in yards, elderly couples sitting on front porches, young mothers hanging laundry on clotheslines. Each photo had a name and date written on the back in Grandpa Frank's handwriting. The newspaper clippings told stories of small victories and community achievements. A high school graduation announcement for a young man whose family had lived in one of Grandpa Frank's houses throughout his childhood. A notice about a community garden started by tenants in the Franklinton neighborhood. An article about a woman who'd started a successful catering business from her kitchen in one of the rental properties. But it was the ledgers that revealed the true scope of what Grandpa Frank had been doing. Each property had its own section, with detailed records of not just rent payments and maintenance costs, but of the families who lived there. He'd noted when children were born, when people lost jobs, when health crises struck. He'd tracked not just financial transactions, but human stories. In Maria Santos's section, I found records of the months when her rent had been reduced or waived entirely. But I also found receipts for the medical equipment he'd purchased for her son, records of the scholarship fund he'd set up for her older daughter, and copies of letters he'd written to help Maria navigate the healthcare system. When Diego's condition worsened, the pattern was repeated throughout the ledgers. Families who'd faced temporary hardships and been carried through them. Children who'd received school supplies or Christmas gifts when their parents couldn't afford them. Elderly tenants who'd been helped with grocery shopping or doctor's appointments when they had nowhere else to turn. Grandpa Frank hadn't been running a rental business. He'd been running a one-man social service agency that happened to be funded by real estate. I found myself crying over those ledgers, overwhelmed by the scope of his quiet generosity and the trust he'd placed in me by passing this responsibility on. But I also felt a growing anger at my family's assumptions about what I should do with this inheritance. They'd looked at 17 rental properties and seen only financial assets to be managed or liquidated. They'd never bothered to ask who, lived in those properties or what role they played in their tenants' lives. They'd never considered that Grandpa Frank might have had reasons beyond profit for keeping rents affordable and maintaining long-term relationships with the families who lived there. The last item in the office was a letter addressed to me, much longer than the note Maria had given me. Grandpa Frank's handwriting filled 3 pages of yellow legal paper, and his words felt like a conversation we'd never had the chance to have in person. "Claire," the letter began, "if you're reading this, you've discovered that I've been keeping secrets from the family. Not because I was ashamed of what I was doing, but because I knew they wouldn't understand it. Your parents and Jessica are good people, but they measure success in dollars and property values. They've never understood that some things are worth more than money, and they've never appreciated that you've always known the difference. These 17 properties represent 40 years of trying to prove that landlords don't have to be slumlords, that profit doesn't have to come at the expense of human dignity. Every family who lives in these houses has a story, and every story matters more than any balance sheet. I'm not asking you to continue my work exactly as I did it. You're smarter than I was, more educated, better equipped to find ways to help people that I never thought of. But I am asking you to remember that wealth without purpose is just hoarding, and that the best investment is always in human potential. Your family will tell you that managing these properties is too complicated, too risky, too time-consuming. They'll offer to help you find better investments, more profitable ways to use your inheritance. They mean well, but they're wrong. The complication is worth it because it means staying connected to real people facing real problems. The risk is worth it because someone has to be willing to prioritize families over profit margins. The time is worth it because these families deserve a landlord who sees them as human beings, not just sources of revenue. I've left you detailed instructions for everything, from which contractors to trust, to which city officials actually care about affordable housing. But more importantly, I've left you relationships with families who will teach you things no business school could ever cover. Don't let anyone convince you that caring about people is naive or impractical. It's the most practical thing in the world, because people who are treated with dignity and respect become the kind of neighbors and community members who make everyone's life better. I love you, Claire. I'm proud of the woman you've become, and I'm grateful that I can trust you with something that matters to me more than anything else I've ever built. Take care of them, and they'll take care of you. That's how real wealth works. Love, Grandpa Frank. P.S. The bottom drawer of the filing cabinet contains thank you letters from tenants over the years. Read them when you're doubting yourself, or when your family is making you feel foolish for caring. They'll remind you why this work matters. I spent the next 2 hours reading through those thank you letters, and by the time I finished, any uncertainty I'd felt about what to do with my inheritance had completely disappeared. Letter after letter from parents whose children had grown up safely in Grandpa Frank's houses, from elderly tenants who'd been able to age in place with dignity, from families who'd been given the stability they needed to build better lives. The letters weren't just expressions of gratitude. They were evidence of impact, proof that one person's commitment to treating people with respect and compassion could ripple out in ways that changed entire lives. When I finally locked up the office and walked back down to the hardware store, I found my father helping a customer select paint colors for a nursery. He looked up when I entered, his expression curious and slightly wary. "Claire, what were you doing upstairs?" "Learning about Grandpa Frank's real legacy," I said. "What do you mean?" I pulled out one of the photographs I'd taken from the office, a picture of 3 generations of the Rodriguez family standing in front of their house with a hand-painted sign that read, "Home Sweet Home." "Did you know that Mrs. Rodriguez has been living in one of his houses for 12 years? I asked. "That her grandson learned to ride a bike in the front yard, and her granddaughter took her first steps on the front porch?" My father glanced at the photo, his expression uncomfortable. "Claire, I know Dad helped people, but that doesn't mean—" "It means everything," I interrupted. "It means that when Jessica talks about selling these properties to developers, she's talking about destroying homes and displacing families. It means that when you suggest hiring property management companies, you're talking about turning relationships into transactions." "That's business, honey," my father said gently. "You can't let emotions cloud your judgment when it comes to business decisions." "Why not?" I asked. "Why can't emotions be part of business decisions? Why can't caring about people be a factor in how I choose to use my inheritance?" My father looked around the hardware store, at the customers browsing the aisles, and the employees who'd worked there for years. "Because emotions don't pay bills or maintain properties or generate the income you need to keep helping people. Grandpa Frank managed to do all of those things while treating his tenants like family," I pointed out. "The properties are profitable, they're well-maintained, the tenants are happy. What exactly is the problem that needs to be solved?" My father didn't have an immediate answer, and I could see him struggling with the disconnect between what I was telling him and what he'd assumed about rental property management. "Claire," he said finally, "your grandfather was exceptional. He had 40 years of experience and relationships that you don't have. You can't just step into his shoes and expect to be able to do what he did." "Maybe not," I admitted, "but I can try. And I can learn. And I can build on what he started instead of tearing it down." Walking out of the hardware store, I felt a clarity I hadn't experienced since arriving in Riverside. My family's concerns weren't invalid, but they were based on assumptions that didn't match the reality of what Grandpa Frank had built. They were worried about problems that didn't exist and trying to solve them by destroying something beautiful and functional. I had 16 more properties to visit, 16 more families to meet, 16 more pieces of Grandpa Frank's legacy to understand, but I already knew what my decision would be. I would keep the properties, learn to manage them myself, and continue the work he'd started. The conversation with my family would be difficult, but it was necessary. They needed to understand that I wasn't making an emotional decision based on sentiment or naivety. I was making a practical decision based on evidence and values and a clear understanding of what success actually looked like. For the first time since inheriting millions of dollars, I felt like I knew exactly what I was supposed to do with them. The emergency family meeting was called for 6 o'clock on a Thursday evening, exactly 1 week after I'd started visiting Grandpa Frank's properties. My mother's voice on the phone had carried an edge of panic I'd rarely heard from her, the kind of urgency usually reserved for actual emergencies rather than family discussions about inheritance management. "Claire, we need to talk. Tonight. There's been a development." I'd spent the day at the Franklinton property, helping an elderly tenant named Robert Williams fix a leaky faucet and listening to his stories about working at the steel mill for 37 years before it closed. Robert had lived in Grandpa Frank's house for 15 years, and his monthly rent was less than what most people paid for a studio apartment. He'd told me that my grandfather had never missed his birthday, always brought him soup when he was sick, and had quietly paid for his prescription medications when his Medicare didn't cover them. Now, sitting in my parents' living room again, I felt the weight of 17 families' stories pressing against my chest. I'd spent a week learning names and listening to histories and understanding the intricate web of relationships Grandpa Frank had built. I'd met children who'd grown up thinking of him as a surrogate grandfather, single mothers who'd been able to pursue education because they weren't spending half their income on rent, and elderly tenants who'd been able to age in place with dignity because someone cared enough to make it possible. My family had spent the same week researching property management companies and calculating potential profits from development deals. "Claire," Jessica began, her voice carrying the forced patience of someone who'd rehearsed this conversation. "We've been doing some research since our last talk, and we've discovered some concerning information about Dad's properties." She slid a folder across the coffee table toward me, thick with printed articles and official-looking documents. Several of these properties are in neighborhoods that are scheduled for urban renewal projects. The city is planning major redevelopment, initiatives that could significantly impact property values. Michael nodded gravely, consulting his ever-present legal pad. What that means is that some of these properties could be subject to eminent domain proceedings. The city could force you to sell at below market rates, or worse, they could declare them blighted and condemn them entirely. Where did you get this information? I asked, flipping through the folder. I have contacts in the city planning department, Jessica said. People who know about development projects before they become public knowledge. They're doing me a favor by giving us advance warning. My father leaned forward, his expression serious and concerned. Claire, this changes everything. If the city is planning to redevelop those neighborhoods, you need to sell now while you still have some control over the process. And my mother added, before the tenants find out and start expecting you to help them relocate or fight the city, you could end up spending thousands of dollars on legal fees and relocation assistance. I studied the documents more carefully, noting the official letterheads and detailed maps showing proposed development zones. It all looked legitimate, and the implications were exactly as dire as my family had described. If these neighborhoods were truly scheduled for urban renewal, my inheritance could become a massive liability instead of an asset. How long do I have? I asked. That's the problem, Michael said. These things can move very quickly once they become official. You could have months or you could have weeks. The only safe option is to sell immediately to buyers who are willing to take on the risk. And you've found buyers? I asked. Jessica's expression brightened noticeably. Actually, yes. I've been in contact with a development group that specializes in exactly these kinds of situations. They're prepared to make an offer on the entire portfolio. What kind of offer? $4.2 million for all 17 properties, Michael said. Cash sale, quick closing, no contingencies. They'll handle all the tenant notification and relocation assistance required by law. The number was significantly less than the property's appraised value, but given the supposed legal complications, it probably represented a reasonable compromise. My family had clearly spent considerable time and effort researching solutions to problems I hadn't even known existed. $4.2 million is still an enormous amount of money, my mother said gently. More than enough to set you up for life, especially if you invest it wisely. And, Jessica added, it would eliminate all the stress and legal liability of property management. You could focus on your real work without worrying about tenant problems or city bureaucracy. Emma and Noah were playing quietly in the corner, building something elaborate with blocks while the adults discussed numbers and legal complications they couldn't understand. Watching them, I thought about the children I'd met that week who lived in Grandpa Frank's houses. Kids who played in the same yards and rode their bikes on the same sidewalks and considered their rental houses to be permanent homes. What happens to the tenants if I sell to this development group? I asked. They'll receive proper legal notice and assistance with relocation, Michael said. The developers are experienced with these transitions. They know how to handle things correctly. But where will they go? I pressed. Maria Santos has lived in her house for 8 years. Her kids go to school in that neighborhood. Mrs. Rodriguez is 74 years old and has lived in the same place for 12 years. Where are they supposed to find affordable housing that will accept them? My family exchanged glances, the kind of wordless communication that suggested they'd discussed this concern privately and agreed on a response. Claire, my father said carefully, that's not really your responsibility. These people were Frank's tenants, not his family. Your obligation is to manage your inheritance responsibly, not to solve other people's housing problems. Besides, Jessica added, urban renewal is generally good for communities. These neighborhoods need investment and improvement. The displaced residents will ultimately benefit from having better housing options. That was when I realized they were lying to me. Not about the development projects or the legal complications or the potential profits from selling. They might be lying about those things too, but what they were definitely lying about was their motivation. They weren't trying to protect me from legal liability or help me make sound financial decisions. They were trying to get me to sell Grandpa Frank's properties because they didn't want me to become the kind of person who prioritized tenants' welfare over profit margins. "Can I see these development plans?" I asked. "Of course," Michael said, producing another folder. "Though I should warn you, city planning documents can be pretty technical and confusing if you're not familiar with zoning law." I spent several minutes studying maps and legal descriptions and project timelines, noting which properties were supposedly affected and what kinds of development were planned. The documents looked official and detailed, but something about them felt wrong in a way I couldn't immediately identify. "These development projects," I said slowly, "they're all scheduled to begin within the next 6 months? That's what makes the timing so critical," Jessica said. "You need to make a decision quickly before the situation gets more complicated." "And this development group that wants to buy the properties, they're local?" "They have offices in Columbus," Michael said. "Very reputable firm with extensive experience in urban renewal projects." I nodded thoughtfully, as if I were seriously considering their proposal. "I'd like to think about this overnight. Can you give me the contact information for the development group? I might want to speak with them directly." "I don't think that's necessary," Jessica said quickly. "I can handle all the communication with them. They're used to working through real estate professionals." "But surely they wouldn't mind speaking with the actual property owner," I said. "Well, no, but..." Jessica looked uncomfortable. "It's just that these negotiations can be very delicate. One wrong word could jeopardize the entire deal." That was when I knew for certain that they were lying. If there really was a development group interested in buying my properties, there would be no reason to prevent me from speaking with them directly. The fact that Jessica was trying to control all communication suggested that either the buyers didn't exist or they weren't offering what she claimed they were offering. "Actually," I said, standing up and gathering the folders they'd given me, "I think I'll do some research of my own before making any decisions. I want to verify these development plans with the city planning department and maybe get a second opinion on the property values." My mother looked alarmed. "Claire, honey, you don't need to make this more complicated than it already is. Jessica has done all the research for you." "I'm sure she has," I said diplomatically, "but this is a very big decision, and I want to make sure I understand all the facts before I commit to anything." "Just be careful who you talk to," Michael warned. "There are a lot of people who might try to take advantage of your situation if they know you're inexperienced with real estate." Walking out to my car, I felt the familiar mixture of anger and sadness that came from realizing my family didn't trust me to handle my own affairs. But this time, the feeling was tempered by something new: absolute certainty about what I needed to do. The next morning, I called David Kellerman and asked him to meet me at his office. I also called Sarah Chen, my best friend from college who'd become a civil rights lawyer specializing in housing discrimination. If my family was trying to manipulate me into selling properties that displaced low-income families, I wanted legal advice from someone who actually cared about tenants' rights. "Claire," Kellerman said when I arrived at his office, "I hope you're not having second thoughts about your inheritance. Your grandfather was very specific about his intentions." "I'm not having second thoughts," I assured him, "but my family is pressuring me to sell the properties, and they've given me some information about development projects that I want to verify." I spread the documents Jessica had given me across his desk, watching his expression as he reviewed them. After several minutes, he looked up with a puzzled frown. "These development plans," he said slowly, "they don't match any projects I'm aware of. And I stay current on all major urban planning initiatives because they affect my clients' property values." "You think they're fake?" "I think they're either outdated, referring to projects that were proposed but never approved, or they've been taken out of context to make the situation seem more urgent than it actually is. Kellerman pulled out his phone. "Let me call someone. At the planning department right now." The conversation that followed confirmed my suspicions. There were no immediate development plans for any of the neighborhoods where Grandpa Frank's properties were located. There had been some preliminary discussions about urban renewal in one area, but those plans had been shelved indefinitely due to budget constraints and community opposition. "Your family has been given inaccurate information," Kellerman said, after ending the call. "Either they were deliberately misled, or they misunderstood what they were told. What about the development group that wants to buy the properties?" "What development group?" Kellerman asked. "I haven't been contacted by anyone representing buyers for your properties." That afternoon, Sarah Chen arrived from Cleveland, armed with legal expertise and a determination to help me navigate whatever scheme my family had concocted. After reviewing all the documents and listening to my summary of the week's events, her assessment was blunt and clear. "Your sister is either working with people who are trying to defraud you, or she's created this entire scenario herself to pressure you into selling," Sarah said. "Either way, what she's doing is ethically questionable and potentially illegal." "But why would she do that?" "Because she's probably terrified that you're going to use your inheritance in ways that don't align with her values or financial interests," Sarah explained. "She sees you as someone who makes decisions based on emotions rather than business sense, and she's trying to save you from yourself. By lying to me? By removing options she thinks are bad for you. In her mind, she's probably justified this as protecting you from making mistakes that could cost you financially or legally." That evening, I asked my family to meet me one more time, but this meeting would be different. This time, I would be the one controlling the conversation. I arrived at my parents' house with Sarah Chen, David Kellerman, and a folder of my own. I'd also brought Maria Santos, who'd insisted on coming when I'd explained what was happening. "Claire," my mother said, looking surprised by the additional guests. "We weren't expecting a crowd." "I thought it would be helpful to have some expert advice," I said, gesturing for everyone to sit down. "I've been researching the development projects you told me about, and I've discovered some interesting information." I placed copies of the real city planning documents on the coffee table, along with a written statement from the planning department confirming that no urban renewal projects were scheduled for any of the relevant neighborhoods. "It turns out," I said calmly, "that the development plans you showed me were either fabricated or taken from old proposals that were never approved. There are no immediate threats to the properties, no eminent domain proceedings, and no urgent need to sell." Jessica's face went pale. Michael stopped taking notes and set down his pen. "I also discovered," I continued, "that no development group has contacted my lawyer about purchasing the properties, which means either these buyers don't exist or you've been negotiating with them without my knowledge or consent." "Claire," my father said, his voice strained, "there must be some misunderstanding." "The only misunderstanding," I interrupted, "is the assumption that I'm too naive or incompetent to manage my own inheritance responsibly." I turned to Maria Santos, who'd been sitting quietly beside Sarah Chen. "Maria, would you mind telling my family what you told me about Grandpa Frank's approach to property management?" For the next 20 minutes, Maria shared stories about the difference Grandpa Frank had made in her life and the lives of her neighbors. She talked about stability and dignity and the kind of security that comes from knowing your landlord sees you as a human being rather than a source of revenue. "Your grandfather," she said, looking directly at my parents, "understood that some things matter more than money. He built something beautiful, and your granddaughter is the right person to continue it." When Maria finished speaking, the room was completely silent. Emma and Noah had stopped playing and were staring at the adults, clearly sensing the tension even if they didn't understand the details. "I've made my decision," I said. "I'm keeping the properties. I'm moving back to Ohio to manage them myself. and I'm going to continue the work that Grandpa Frank started." "Claire," Jessica said, her voice tight with frustration, "you have no idea what you're getting yourself into. Property management is incredibly complicated." "Then I'll learn," I said simply. "I'll hire good people to help me. I'll make mistakes and figure out how to do better, and I'll build on what Grandpa Frank created instead of destroying it." "This is a mistake," Michael said bluntly. "You're letting emotions cloud your judgment, and you're going to end up losing money and creating problems for yourself that could have been avoided." "Maybe," I acknowledged, "but they'll be my mistakes, made according to my values, in service of something I believe in." I stood up, signaling that the conversation was over. "I want to thank you all for your concern and your advice. I know you were trying to help me, even if I disagree with your methods." "Claire," my mother said, her voice breaking slightly, "we just want what's best for you." "I know," I said gently. "But what's best for me isn't necessarily what would be best for you. And that's okay. We don't have to want the same things or make the same choices." 6 months later, I was sitting in the apartment above the Martinez Hardware Store, which I'd converted into my property management office. The walls were covered with photos of tenants and their families, updates on community projects, and thank you letters from people whose lives had been touched by affordable, stable housing. I'd hired a small team of local contractors and property managers who shared my commitment to treating tenants with respect and dignity. We'd implemented a tenant advisory board that gave residents a voice in decisions about their homes and neighborhoods. We'd started a small scholarship program for children of tenants who wanted to pursue higher education. The work was challenging, sometimes frustrating, and occasionally heartbreaking. But it was also deeply rewarding in ways that no amount of passive investment income could ever match. My family had gradually come to accept my decision, though I suspected they still thought I was making a mistake. Jessica had apologized for the deception about the development projects, explaining that she genuinely believed she was protecting me from problems I wasn't equipped to handle. "I'm proud of what you're doing," she'd said during our most recent conversation. "I still think you're crazy, but I'm proud of you." That was probably the best reconciliation I could hope for. We loved each other, but we'd never see the world the same way, and that was okay. The most important validation came from the families who lived in Grandpa Frank's houses, who'd welcomed me into their community and taught me things about resilience and dignity that no business school could ever cover. They'd shown me that true wealth wasn't measured in dollars and property values, but in relationships and impact, and the difference one person could make by choosing to care about others. Emma and Noah visited sometimes, helping me deliver holiday gifts to tenants and learning about the importance of treating everyone with kindness and respect. They were too young to understand the financial details of my inheritance, but they understood that their Aunt Claire was doing something that mattered, something that their great-grandfather would have been proud of. Standing in my office, looking out at the neighborhood I'd chosen to call home, I thought about Grandpa Frank's final letter and his faith that I would know what to do with his legacy. He'd been right to trust me, not because I'd made perfect decisions or avoided all mistakes, but because I'd stayed true to the values that had guided him. The inheritance had given me choices I'd never had before, but the most important choice had been the easiest one: to build something meaningful rather than simply accumulating wealth, to prioritize people over profit, and to prove that caring about others wasn't naive or impractical, but the foundation of everything worthwhile. The morning sun filtered through the windows of my new office as I reviewed the quarterly reports spread across my desk. 18 months had passed since I'd made the decision to keep Grandpa Frank's properties, and the numbers told a story that would have surprised my family. Not only were the properties generating steady income, but occupancy rates had increased, maintenance costs had decreased, and tenant satisfaction surveys showed remarkable improvements across all metrics. But the real story wasn't in the spreadsheets. It was in the framed photograph on my desk showing the ribbon-cutting ceremony for the Franklinton Community Learning Center, a converted garage space behind one of the rental houses that now offered after-school tutoring, computer classes, and job training workshops. It was in the thank you card from teenage Marcus Johnson, who'd received one of our first college scholarships and was now studying engineering at Ohio State. It was in the daily reminders that Grandpa Frank's vision of compassionate property management wasn't just idealistic dreaming, but a sustainable business model that created value for everyone involved. My phone buzzed with a text from Maria Santos. Mrs. Chen's granddaughter is visiting from California today. She wants to meet the lady who's continuing Frank's work. Can you stop by later? Mrs. Chen lived in the house next door to Maria, a quiet 78-year-old woman who'd moved to Ohio from Taiwan in the 1970s and had been one of Grandpa Frank's tenants for nearly 20 years. Her granddaughter Jennifer was a successful tech entrepreneur in Silicon Valley who'd grown up hearing stories about the kind landlord who'd made her grandmother's American dream possible. I'd learned to treasure these moments when the extended family members of tenants visited, because they offered perspective on the long-term impact of stable, affordable housing. Jennifer Chen had founded 2 successful startups and employed over 100 people, but she credited her success to the foundation of security her grandmother had provided during her childhood visits to Ohio. That security had been made possible by a landlord who charged fair rent and treated his tenants with dignity. The knock on my office door interrupted my reflection. "Come in," I called, expecting to see Janet Morrison, my property manager, with updates on the morning's maintenance calls. Instead, Jessica entered, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing an expression I'd rarely seen from her. Genuine curiosity mixed with what might have been admiration. "I brought peace offerings," she said, setting one of the cups on my desk. "And I was hoping you might have time to show me what you've built here." Our relationship had evolved considerably since the confrontation 18 months earlier. The anger and manipulation had been replaced by a cautious respect, though I suspected Jessica still thought my approach to property management was unnecessarily complicated. This was the first time she'd actually asked to see my operation firsthand. "I'd love to show you around," I said, genuinely pleased by her interest. "Fair warning, though, it might take a while. There's a lot to see." We started with the property. Files which had grown far beyond Grandpa Frank's handwritten ledgers into a comprehensive system that tracked not just rental payments and maintenance issues, but also family milestones, educational achievements, and community involvement. Each tenant had a profile that read more like a social service case file than a traditional rental record. "This is Robert Williams," I explained, pulling out a thick folder. "He's 76 years old, lives on Social Security, and has been in the same house for 16 years. He's also our unofficial neighborhood watch coordinator and has prevented 3 break-ins by keeping an eye on vacant properties during showings." Jessica studied the file, noting the detailed health information, emergency contacts, and records of community contributions. "You track all of this for every tenant?" "Not track," I corrected. "Document. There's a difference. Robert wants us to know about his medical conditions because he lives alone and worries about emergencies. He volunteers the neighborhood watch information because he's proud of his contributions. We write it down because it helps us treat him as a whole person, rather than just a rent payment." Our next stop was the maintenance workshop I'd set up in the basement of the building. 3 local contractors worked part-time maintaining the properties, but they also taught basic repair skills to tenants who wanted to learn. The workshop had evolved into an informal community center where people gathered to fix things, share tools, and help each other with projects. "The monthly workshops save money on maintenance costs," I explained, as we watched a tenant named Carlos teach his teenage son how to replace a faucet washer. "But more importantly, they give people ownership over their living spaces and build connections between neighbors." Jessica observed the easy camaraderie between tenants and contractors, the way people offered advice and assistance without being asked, the pride evident in voices as people discussed improvements they'd made to their homes. "This doesn't feel like a typical landlord-tenant relationship," she said. Because it's not, I replied. Grandpa Frank figured out that treating people as partners rather than customers creates better outcomes for everyone. Tenants take better care of properties they feel connected to. Neighbors look out for each other's homes, and communities become stronger when people have stability and investment in where they live. We spent an hour at the Franklinton Community Learning Center, where I introduced Jessica to Carmen Rodriguez, a single mother who'd started the after-school program after losing her job and needing a way to contribute to her community while searching for new employment. Carmen had since found work as a teacher's aide, but she continued running the tutoring program because she'd seen how much it meant to local families. Before Claire took over, Carmen explained to Jessica, we had these services scattered all over the city. Kids had to take 2 buses to get to homework help. Parents missed job training because they couldn't find childcare. Now everything happens right here in the neighborhood, in a space we all helped create. Jessica asked thoughtful questions about funding, logistics, and legal liability, approaching the community center with the same analytical mindset she brought to her real estate business. But I could see her trying to reconcile the professional competence of the operation with her previous assumptions about my inexperience and impracticality. How do you measure success? She asked as we walked back toward the office. What do you mean? In real estate, success is usually measured by profit margins, property appreciation, return on investment. How do you determine whether what you're doing is working? I'd been expecting this question since she arrived, and I'd given it considerable thought over the past 18 months. We measure success by stability, I said. Average length of tenancy, school performance of children living in our properties, number of families who've been able to save money for major goals, community engagement rates, tenant satisfaction scores. And financially, the properties. Generate consistent income, maintain their value, and operate at sustainable cost levels, I said. We're not maximizing profit, but we're creating long-term value in ways that purely profit-focused management never could. Jessica nodded slowly, processing information that clearly challenged some of her assumptions about effective business practices. Our final stop was Maria Santos's house, where Mrs. Chen's granddaughter Jennifer was visiting. Jennifer greeted me with the kind of warm enthusiasm usually reserved for family members, and I found myself pulled into a conversation about the intergenerational impact of housing stability. My grandmother talks about Frank Martinez the way other people talk about family, Jennifer explained to Jessica. When I was a kid visiting here, I thought every landlord brought tenants groceries when they were sick or helped kids with homework, when their parents were working late shifts. Mrs. Chen, who spoke limited English but understood everything, nodded vigorously and disappeared into her kitchen, returning with a plate of homemade dumplings and a photo album spanning 20 years of life in her rental house. Look, Mrs. Chen said in careful English, pointing to pictures of Jennifer at various ages. She learned to drive in that driveway. First job interview, she practiced here in living room. College graduation party, we have in backyard. Jessica studied the photos, seeing decades of milestones celebrated in a space that had remained consistently affordable and secure despite changes in the housing market and economic conditions. Your grandfather, Jennifer said to me, created something my grandmother couldn't have found anywhere else. Not just affordable rent, but a landlord who saw her as a person worth investing in. That security allowed her to invest in me, which allowed me to build businesses that now employ people and create value in ways that ripple out far beyond what any traditional rental property could achieve. Walking back to the office, Jessica was unusually quiet. She'd spent the morning seeing evidence that contradicted nearly everything she'd believed about property management, tenant relations, and the proper role of business in community life. I owe you an apology, she said finally, not just for the fake development plans, but for assuming you didn't know what you were doing. You were trying to protect me, I said. I understand that. But I was also trying to protect my own worldview, Jessica admitted. It was easier to believe you were being naive than to consider that maybe my approach to business was missing something important. We spent the afternoon in my office, where Jessica asked detailed questions about tenant screening, maintenance protocols, financial planning, and legal compliance. She approached my operation with the same professional thoroughness she brought to her own business, but this time with genuine respect for what I'd accomplished rather than skepticism about my capabilities. "You've built something remarkable here," she said as the day wound down, "and I'm starting to understand why Dad trusted you with it." "Grandpa Frank didn't just trust me with properties," I said. "He trusted me with relationships. The buildings are just the framework for something much more valuable." That evening, I found myself alone in the office, reviewing applications for our fall scholarship program and preparing for the next day's tenant advisory board meeting. The work was demanding and sometimes overwhelming, but it was also deeply satisfying in ways I'd never experienced in my previous career. My phone rang, and I was surprised to see my mother's number on the caller ID. Our conversations had become more frequent and more comfortable over the past year, but she rarely called in the evening. "Claire, honey, I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." "Just catching up on paperwork, Mom. What's up?" "I wanted to tell you something," she said, and there was something different in her voice, a softness I hadn't heard in years. "Your father and I drove past the Franklinton property today, and we saw children playing in that little park area behind the community center." "Oh, that's the playground the tenants built last month," I said. "They organized the whole project themselves, got donated materials, spent 3 weekends building everything from scratch." "It's beautiful," my mother said quietly. "And seeing those families together, watching the way the older kids were helping, the younger ones, listening to parents talking while their children played. I finally understood what your grandfather was trying to create." I felt tears pricking my eyes, not from sadness, but from relief. My mother had never criticized my choices directly, but I'd always sensed her worry that I was wasting opportunities or making decisions that would limit my potential. Hearing her recognize the value in what I was doing felt like a gift I hadn't known I needed. "Mom, that means everything to me." "I'm proud of you, Claire. Proud of the woman you've become and the life you've chosen to build. Your grandfather would be so happy to see what you've done with his legacy." After we hung up, I sat in the quiet office surrounded by photos and files and evidence of lives made better by stable, affordable housing. The work wasn't finished. There were always new challenges, families facing crises, properties needing attention, systems that could be improved. But for the first time since inheriting Grandpa Frank's properties, I felt completely certain that I was exactly where I belonged. The next morning brought news that would test everything I'd built over the past 18 months. David Kellerman called with information about a development opportunity that could change the entire landscape of my property management operation. "Claire, I've been contacted by a nonprofit housing organization that's looking for partners in a major affordable housing initiative," he explained. "They're impressed by what you've accomplished with your current properties, and they're wondering if you'd be interested in expanding your model to other neighborhoods." The proposal was ambitious and complex. The nonprofit had secured funding to purchase and renovate abandoned properties throughout Central Ohio, creating affordable housing that would be managed according to principles similar to those I'd implemented with Grandpa Frank's properties. They were looking for experienced property managers who understood that successful affordable housing required more than just low rent prices. "They want to partner with people who have proven track records of creating community-focused housing," Kellerman continued. "Your operation is exactly what they're looking for." The opportunity was exciting and terrifying in equal measure. Expanding would mean taking on significantly more responsibility, hiring additional staff, developing systems that could maintain quality across a larger portfolio. It would also mean the chance to create the kind of housing opportunities that could transform entire neighborhoods. I spent the next week researching the nonprofit, reviewing their funding sources, and evaluating whether my 18 months of experience had prepared me for something this ambitious. The answer wasn't immediately clear, but the more I learned about their mission and approach, the more convinced I became that this was the natural next step in continuing Grandpa Frank's work. The decision ultimately came down to a simple question: what would Grandpa Frank do? He'd spent 40 years quietly building something that mattered, expanding when opportunities arose, always prioritizing people over profit while maintaining sustainable business practices. The nonprofit partnership offered a chance to do the same thing on a much larger scale. 3 months later, I stood in the construction site that would become the first phase of the Riverside Community Housing Initiative, watching crews install solar panels on rooftops and talking with future tenants about the community garden they were planning for the central courtyard. The project would create 48 units of affordable housing, along with shared spaces for education, childcare, and community activities. My role as managing partner meant overseeing not just the construction and leasing process, but also the development of programs that would turn a housing complex into a genuine community. We were implementing everything I'd learned from managing Grandpa Frank's properties, but on a scale that could impact hundreds of families instead of dozens. Jessica had become an unexpected ally in the expansion, using her real estate expertise to help navigate zoning challenges and permitting processes. She'd also introduced me to contractors and suppliers who were committed to fair pricing and quality work, relationships that proved invaluable as we moved from planning to construction. "I still think you're crazy," she told me as we watched children from the neighborhood explore the construction site during a community tour. "But you're the good kind of crazy, the kind that changes things for the better." The ribbon-cutting ceremony for the first phase of the Riverside Community Housing Initiative took place on a sunny October morning, exactly 2 years after Grandpa Frank's death. The entire community turned out for the celebration, including tenants from the original properties, local officials who'd supported the project, and representatives from the nonprofit partners who'd made the expansion possible. Standing at the podium, looking out at faces that represented every stage of my journey from uncertain inheritor to confident housing advocate, I thought about the path that had brought me to this moment. The inheritance had given me resources and opportunities, but the real transformation had come from choosing to use those resources in service of something larger than personal wealth accumulation. 2 years ago, I began, I inherited properties from my grandfather, Frank Martinez, a man who understood that housing is about more than buildings. It's about stability, dignity, and the foundation that allows families to build better lives. I talked about the lessons I'd learned from tenants who'd taught me about resilience and community, from contractors who'd shown me that quality work was an expression of care, from neighbors who'd demonstrated that people would invest in their communities when given the opportunity and support to do so. This project represents not just 48 new homes, but 48 new chances for families to thrive, I continued. It represents the belief that everyone deserves housing that supports their potential rather than limiting it. After the ceremony, I found myself surrounded by well-wishers and supporters, people whose lives had been touched by affordable housing initiatives and who understood the importance of what we were trying to accomplish. But the conversation that meant the most came from Emma and Noah, now 10 and 12 years old, who'd attended the ceremony with their parents. "Aunt Claire," Emma said, "when I grow up, I want to help people the way you do." "What way is that?" I asked. "By seeing what they need and then building it for them," she replied with the straightforward clarity that only children possess. Noah nodded in agreement. "Great-Grandpa Frank would be proud of you," he said solemnly. "You took what he gave you and made it bigger and better." That evening, alone in my apartment above the hardware store, I pulled out the last letter Grandpa Frank had written to me, the one I'd read countless times over the past 2 years. His words about wealth without purpose being just hoarding, about investment in human potential being the best return, had guided every major decision I'd made since inheriting his properties. But it was his final line that resonated most strongly as I reflected on the day's celebration. "Take care of them, and they'll take care of you." That's how real wealth works. I'd started this journey thinking about financial inheritance and property management. I discovered instead that real wealth was measured in relationships, in communities strengthened by stability and care, in opportunities created for people to reach their potential. The money and properties had been tools for building something, more valuable than any bank account could contain. Looking out my window at the neighborhood where I'd chosen to make my home, where families were settling into their evening routines in houses that provided more than just shelter, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing your life's work aligns with your deepest values. The inheritance had changed everything, but not in the way my family had expected. It hadn't made me wealthy in the conventional sense. It had made me rich in ways that mattered more than any financial portfolio could measure. It had given me the chance to continue something beautiful that Grandpa Frank had started, and to build something even more beautiful for the future. And that, I realized, was exactly the kind of legacy worth inheriting. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.